Okay, guys, welcome to Greece. We are on chapter 4. This is the second lecture for this week. It is not included in the quiz. This will be, but it will be moving. This will be part of the next chapter. As a reminder, guys, you have to participate in the discussion boards for attendance purposes. That is a requirement. Um, I, I'm looking right now, and roughly half the class is about to be dropped because they're not participating in discussion boards. So please keep up with that. Okay, let's talk about chapter 4. So the early Aegean cultures, right? These are the cultures in and around the Mediterranean on the Greece side. Um, the people of the area had a word, archaeologia, which is what we translate to archaeology. And we think of archaeology as people out digging up ancient civilizations, that type of thing. But for them, this word really meant more of just a way of knowing the past, of thinking about the past. Um, so, we do that by going back and digging things up. For them, it was through myths and legends. Um, Page 102, talking about the Cyclades. These are a group of islands that are located between Greece and Crete. Crete being one of the more important islands of the Mediterranean. Um, and you could basically sail almost all the way from mainland Greece out to Crete, and you'd always be within sight of these islands. And so we think right now of people as seafarers, who take these big epic journeys. For the Greeks, it's kind of like, well, you're always within sight of land. Okay, it's not like crossing the Atlantic. They sailed these ships called triremes, which were shallowly drafted, really kind of for skimming from island to island more than anything. Um, these islands had a lot of marble on them. A lot of the islands were inhabited by small little villages, if not major cities. People would just be like, hey, you know what? I don't really like the island I'm on. I'm going to go live on another one if they found a good, convenient place. It wasn't hard to get from one to the other. Um, Sculpture in these areas, if you look at the figurine on 102, it looks very modern, doesn't it? We look at this and kind of this uh, smooth forms, this lack of distinction. It almost reminds you of modern art. And that's because a lot of the modernists do draw on this era, the Cycladic figures, for inspiration. If you see pieces now that harken back to this, that's why. Um, let's see here. One of the things to know, they do talk about one of the major volcanic eruptions there on 102. There were several volcanoes in the area that would explode with cataclysmic results. Down the road, we're going to get to Pompeii. The one that they are talking about, um, the island of Santorini, um, one of the largest eruptions in 10,000 years, 7 cubic miles of magma, and a 23-mile high cloud. Um, just, uh, just crazy. Um, Left evidence worldwide because of the ash that got spewed into the air, traveled on winds around the world, affecting trees as far as California. So, um, but one of the things that did happen with this is, as with all volcanic eruptions, is a lot of things ended up preserved, and we were able to find some of the homes well preserved within it. We see some of the mural paintings, and a level of hygiene that was almost unprecedented for the times. Um, there was clay pipes, there was interior plumbing that we don't see again until the Romans. So the level of knowledge on these islands was actually quite advanced for the time. All right, so let's talk about Crete. Crete, the big island there that you see on page 102, kind of near the south. Um, and Crete was really the center of these early cultures. They call it the Minoan culture. Flourished for several hundred years. Minoan, named after King Minos. Um, the bull being an important symbol of this culture. The regularly sacrificed bull, it was a symbol of male virility. I'm like a bull. We'll get to that a little bit later. We're talking about the Minotaur. Um, the two different kind of frescoes. Take just a quick look at that, if you would, on page 103. Um, Rather than applying pigment to the dry wall, as in the fresco secco technique of the Egyptians, Minoan artists used buon fresco techniques, which would later be used by Renaissance painters. Um, so they would mix the pigment with water and then applied to a wall that had been coated with this wet lime plaster. And so as it dries, it literally hardens into the exterior of the wall. So it's very durable. Now, eventually, of course, it'll flake off, but it's much more durable because it won't come off as easily. Um, all right, Minoan religion. Um, Been some debate about this. Definitely a pantheistic religion. Um, Sir Arthur Evans kind of thought that there was several different female goddesses that were worshipped, but they were really all uh, aspects of one. Um, that's open to debate, and he's had a hard time establishing that. But Minoan goddesses were associated with a variety of fertility and harvest uh, motifs. Um, they worshipped on mountaintops, and we do see this idea that as we look at hills and valleys, for example, that resemble the curves of the female body, and so we see this throughout the Minoan culture. Um, I'm not going to get too deep into the palace of Minos, um, other than to say that it was very labyrinthian, and that is important. Labyrinthian, like, is in like a maze, um, and this is important because this relates to the legend of the Minotaur, which is one I'm sure that many of you have heard. Um, King Minos wanted the gods to basically boasted that the gods would give him anything he wished. So he prayed for this great bull to sacrifice to the gods. And so the gods sent him this massive white bull. Specifically, King Poseidon sent him this bull from the island, or from the sea. And Minos is like, here is this beautiful, great bull that the gods gave me that I'm supposed to sacrifice. I don't really want to sacrifice it. And so he kept it. Now this pissed off the gods, specifically Poseidon. And so Poseidon made the queen fall in love with the bull. And so the queen had Daedalus, and we're going to talk some more about Daedalus later. Daedalus was a great inventor. Make this exterior form of a female bull, and then she climbed into it so that she could have sex with the bull. The result of that was the Minotaur, half bull, bull's head on a man's body. And not only that, but the the bull seemed to like eating people. And the king didn't want to necessarily kill this offspring of the thing from the gods. So he sacrificed daughters and sons of the people to the bull. 14 from Athens every year. So Theseus, who was the son of King Aegean of Athens, said that he was going to kill it. So he sets sail. He seduces the daughter of the king, and she gives him a spool of thread that he then, as he goes through the maze, he unwinds the thread behind him so that he can find his way back out, because everybody else that got thrown into the maze with the Minotaur gets eaten because they couldn't find their way out. She also gave him a sword, and he he kills the Minotaur, sails off with the daughter of the king, but then abandons her on an island, one of the islands, where Dionysus, who's one of the gods, finds her and is like, hey, she's hot, and marries her. So she got dumped by a human and upgraded to a god. Worked out for her overall. Um, he did, however, Theseus did forget to change his sails, and black sails represented that a noble had died. Um, and he forgot to change them, and so as he's sailing back in, he committed suicide, which resulted in Theseus becoming king. So it's really kind of an interesting story. And now, one of the important parts of the story is we talked before about emergence myths, right? People coming from the ground or how people came into being. This story is really an emergence myth, but rather than being an emergence myth of how people came into being, it's an emergence myth of how a culture came into being, because Theseus became the first real ruler of what we know as Athens proper after overthrowing the rule of Crete. So this is Athens' coming out story, so to speak. Um, Eventually, the Minoans abandoned the palace at Knossos on Crete, um, and were occupied by. This was occupied by the Mycenaean culture. Some people suggested that there's deforestation of the island to where they ran out of resources. Um, some people think that after the volcanic eruption, that destroyed a large portion of the population, even though it wasn't on their island, and so they left. And the other thought is maybe just they got their asses kicked by the Mycenaeans, which any one of those three or a combination of those three is possible. Um, Minoan metalwork, very well. Look at the repose. They're on page 107. The technique in which they hammer from the inside of like a cup to show a pattern. So they would get a pattern and then they bang it out from the inside. Um, Whereas Minoan towns were unfortified, you look at the battle scenes of Mycenaean culture, they're much more warlike people than the Minoans were. Um, the Greeks looked at the Mycenaean culture and they saw some of these huge masonry blocks. They called it Cyclopean masonry. And they called it Cyclopean masonry because these blocks were absolutely massive. And if you guys are familiar with the idea of a cyclops, right? These one-eyed giants. They call it Cyclopean masonry because they thought that cyclops were the only people possible of moving blocks that large. Um, Mycenaean culture is feudal, and we're going to talk more about feudal culture down the road when we start talking about France and England, Germany, and how the feudal culture worked there. Um, but the feudal culture basically means that there is this system of interdependence between lords or rulers and those below them. And what I mean by that is if kings controlled an area, right? The lesser lords in that area owe their fealty to that king, and then the normal people would owe their fealty to the lords, and then the higher lords would owe their allegiance to still bigger lords. So that lord could then say, "Hey, I need, I need all my troops," and he could basically call troops from every place under his control. They also paid taxes to them. They would owe them fealty. They would owe them crops. So everybody had to pay up the chain of command. And so you end up with a system like that. You end up with this large bureaucracy. There'd be tax collectors, civil servants, military, basically all over the various parts of the kingdom. Looking really quick on page 109, the terms shaft graves and the tholos. The tholos is like the beehive, right? To where they would construct these tombs that were kind of shaped like a beehive with an entryway. They'd have talks about the relieving triangle, right? To where it was constructed in such a way that you have the lintel stone here and the relieving triangle at an angle up above it to disperse the weight so that it didn't fall in. So just a good term to know. Okay, let's talk about Homer. We cannot talk about the Greeks without talking about my man Homer. All right. So first of all, before we get to Homer, we got to talk about the Phoenicians. So the Phoenicians were traders. Okay, they did a lot of trade throughout the Mediterranean. But the important thing with the Phoenicians is their alphabet, and a lot of our letters today still bear some resemblance to the Phoenician alphabet. Um, Phoenicia had one of the best and easiest to use alphabets up to that point. And it was easy to put on papyrus or like a paper scroll, all right? Whereas before, we're talking about cuneiform, which you have to get this clay tablet and try to use a reed to mark on it. They had ink and paper, baby. So, I mean, much, much simpler to use. And what's important about the Phoenicians with that alphabet is they traveled so far all over the area. And guess what they brought with them? They brought that alphabet. And that alphabet, because it was so easy to use, became used by everybody in the area. And the Greeks are like, shoot, we like that. And so as they traded with the Greeks, the Greeks traded with the Phoenicians, they saw the alphabet, they took it largely intact. It did modify over time, but the Greek alphabet is very similar to that of the Phoenicians. Okay, now, Homer. Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are the two earliest epic works in written language, at least to the extent. Okay, there are other things that are epic in scope, right? We've got Gilgamesh. Okay, Gilgamesh probably the earliest epic of all. But this is the earliest Greek epic. This is the earliest one in this part of the world. And so scholars believed for a long time that these were purely works of fiction, just made up, right? It's about the Greeks coming to Troy, right? The Trojan horse. And they basically thought it was all made up. And then, son of a bitch, they found Troy, right? They found the city. And so all of a sudden it goes from story to hold it. This is historical, at least to some extent. Now, to what extent, we don't know. How real Achilles and Hector and all these heroes are, we don't know. But we do know that there was a war. We do know that there was a Troy. There probably was some version, at least, of the Trojan horse. Now, we tend to think of this as, this massive, giant horse with hundreds of troops in it. No. It's very possibility, it was good size, only carried a certain amount of troops, and what they probably did wasn't so much as take the city themselves, but threw open the gates. Okay? So, this is an incredibly long work, because that's what epics are. Epics discuss, epics cover things that impact nations, okay, that change the scope of the world as it's known. You know what? You guys have many of you have probably been following an epic for years. The Marvel Universe, right? The Marvel Universe is epic in its scope. It is big. It is huge. It covers the world, right? It's a long story with a wide cast of heroes. And that's what the Iliad and the Odyssey were, right? These big, sweeping stories about gods and heroes and battles and just all of that, okay? Think of it as the Marvel Universe of its time. Now, this was originally probably performed mostly verbally, and then Homer's like, no, we got to write this down. We've got to write this down, because otherwise it's going to get lost. They use formulaic epitaphs, in other words, kind of descriptive phrases that are used over and over again in order to hold on to it. And then we talk about the epic meter. So this is on the bottom of page 110, the epic meter. And this is a hexameter structure, okay? In other words, 6 feet. Now, what we mean by a foot is a pattern of syllables, of stressed and unstressed syllables. Do not get off of, let's find a good example. Once upon a midnight dreary, as I pondered, weak and weary. Right? Do you feel that up, down? Each one of those up, downs, that's a foot. That's a type of foot. Okay, it's called iambic. Now, in hexameter, you would have 6 of those feet. Bum, 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 bum. But the way that they did it, their feet is a dactyl, which is a long syllable plus 2 short ones, or a spondy, which is 2 long syllables. Fleet-footed. Be, papa, be, Papa, right? That's a dactyl. That's a long syllable. Fleet-footed. Papa. Okay, followed by two short. Or you have a spondy. Okay, two long syllable. Bronze armed. Right? Those are two long syllables. Bum bum. So, in Greek epics, the first 4 feet of the line can be either dactyls or spondies. You just have to have dactyls or spondies. But the last 2 beats have to be a dactyl followed by a spondee. Has to be that order. First 4 can be, you can have 4 spondies, 4 dactyls, 2 dactyls, 2 spondies in the order. It doesn't matter. But the last 2 feet have to be a dactyl and a spondee. And this is the epic meter. Okay? There's about, in the Iliad, there's 15,693 lines. Long poem, right? And in Athens, it had to be recited every 4 years. And then in Alexandria and Egypt, the Library of Alexandria burning down, destruction of it is one of the greatest losses of knowledge in history. We'll talk about that later. And scribes took that 15,693 lines and broke it into 24 books that were easier to follow, okay? So the poem was so influential, it established what an epic meant. Gilgamesh was an epic, but it didn't define an epic. It was just a story. The Iliad and the Odyssey did certain things in certain ways. Gilgamesh happened to meet it already, but this defined what an epic was. Okay? You start the poem in what was called in media res, which means in the middle of things. In other words, things are already going. Okay? There's a muse at the beginning, right? You're invoking them. You're stating this poem's subject right away. And it talks about the important deeds and history of a poet's culture. So even though the Marvel Universe is fictional, right, it still addresses some important aspects of our culture. What is a hero, right? Think about how this universe defines what a hero is and what is considered heroic, and the struggle between that, and how the impact of government, right? We talk about terrorism in there, okay? So all of these different things are addressing what's important in a culture, even if it's fictional, okay? All right, so let's talk about the Iliad. War, Greece, Troy. We start off on the beach. Achilles, the big hero, right? But Achilles is a big hero. He also has a giant ego to go along with being a big hero, because that's what heroes tend to do, right? Think Tony Stark and Iron Man, right? And so Agamemnon, who is the king, right, sees a girl that Achilles has claimed, and he decides, I want that girl. And so he takes her from the best warrior. And Achilles is like, fine, screw you. I'm not going to fight. And without Achilles there and his men, the battle starts going against them, and Troy starts throwing the Greeks back to the ocean. Greece is attacking Troy. And Troy is by the sea. The Greeks are on the shore outside of Troy. And they've established barricades, fortifications further and further forward. Troy starts to throw them back. Okay? Patroclus, who is Achilles' close friend, probably his lover. Greeks did not look, the Greeks actually felt that a man should have a male lover when he went to battle, because you would fight for that guy. Okay? And so the distaste that our culture has shown for homosexuality did not exist during Greek times. In fact, it was encouraged among warriors. So Patroclus, Achilles' close companion, asked if he could at least wear Achilles' armor, and Achilles was like, sure. And so Patroclus went out and fought as Achilles, and he started to throw back the Trojans. Okay, And one of the big heroes of Troy was a guy by the name of Sarpedon, right? And Patroclus kills him. Now, one of the things, a term to know about the Greeks is the term arete. This has gotten changed into art, right? And they think of it as virtue, right? Is how it's often translated, but really it means being the best possible version of yourself. Okay, you are the best you can be. You are the have maximized who you are, and this was the goal for all Greeks, and they measured that through competition against each other. And for a warrior to reach that point, he had to match up against other great warriors, and this is what we see with Patroclus and Sarpedon. Okay, um, there on 112 we see an amphora, the kind of a Greek jar, right? It's kind of pear-shaped, and it shows two warriors combating against each other, reaching that height of arte. Okay? All right, back to Achilles. Um, Hector, who is the son of the king of Troy, sees Sarpedon fall. He's pissed. He comes out. He kills Patroclus. They thought they killed Achilles. They didn't. Achilles, now he lost his bud, and he's kicking himself for staying out of the battle. So he goes out, fights Hector, beats Hector, but then takes the dude, ties him by the ankles to the back of his chariot, and drags him around the city. And this is, I mean, by any standards, considered unacceptable. Okay, this was a guy who was fighting for his city. He was a noble warrior and was considered not to deserve that. Okay, Priam, king of Troy, sneaks out, begs Achilles for his son's body. Um, the fall of Troy. From there, we move on. The fall of Troy actually takes place in the beginning of the Odyssey, not at the end of the Iliad. So we move into another poem, equally long, right? And this is where we get the famous Trojan horse, right? Hollowed out horse presented as a gift. All the Greeks disappear. Troy thinks, yay, we've won after so many years. They bring this horse into the city, and the Greeks pop out, and the gates are opened, and the walls of Troy fall. And this was the thing. The reason that the Greeks couldn't get into Troy was because they had these amazing high walls, right? And how do you get past it? They couldn't. They didn't have the siege equipment. But the Trojan horse allowed them to enter the city, open the gates, and to overthrow the Trojans. Now, the Iliad is about Achilles' journey home. Oh, I'm sorry, Odysseus' journey home. Different person, also fought in the war. So Odysseus is traveling home. He has all these adventures on the various islands, right? And he's trying to get back to his wife, Penelope. He's been gone for 20 years. And Penelope comes up with this trick to keep people from trying to marry her, because Odysseus is a king, right? And so she says that she's making her, because Odysseus is assumed to be dead, so she's making her mourning scarf, right? The thing to wear over her head for mourning the death of her husband. So she's like, oh no, I can't marry, I have to finish this first. So during the day, she weaves it, and at night, she undoes what she did the day before. So she's constantly weaving this for 20 years. So one of the things to know about the Greeks, we talk about the Greeks, Western culture at this point talks about God as perfect, okay? The Greeks did not view their gods as perfect. Their gods were very human. They were petty. They were spiteful. They fought over stupid stuff. Zeus cheated on his wife. Hera was jealous and spiteful. So as opposed to saying, okay, the gods have dictated a pattern of behavior, it's more like, we need to be the best people that we can be, right? Because the gods aren't any better than us. We just need to be good people. And here's what being a good person means. And by not deferring their behavior away from themselves they had a more humanistic code of ethics focused on people and what people needed. Um, okay, let's talk about the Greek polis. Okay, you've heard the term metropolis. Okay, metropolis. Okay, it basically means city. All right, this or a city state. Um, the Greeks were constantly. If you didn't like the town you lived in, you'd get together with some of your buddies and go, "Hey, let's go make a town," and you'd go find people and you'd just make another town, and you'd have your own rules. And this act, there were at one point there was about as 1,500 different polises in the area, um, and most they shared some cultural values, right? They had some things in common, but it wasn't a country like we think about now as a country, right? We talk about the Greek culture. Yes, there was a Greek culture, but there wasn't a unified Greek country. Okay, and these were all around the Mediterranean, from Spain pushing into Turkey. Okay, so realize that when we're talking about ancient Greece and we talk about Greek culture, we're not talking about Greece as unified. We're talking about these polises. Okay. Um, they competed against each other. Now, uh, they shared some things in common. So most of them had a couple of basic things in common. One was an acropolis. Okay, and this acropolis was the religious center. Um, it was often on a hill from which they could see down around them, defensive, right? Um, and then below that, you have the agora, which is like an open area. Uh, it often served as the marketplace, right? People from the outer part of town, because a lot of times when we think of the Greek polis, there was the town and then there was the surrounding countryside where food was grown. So they would bring food in to the agora and sell food to the people who lived in town. Okay, um, but more than that, it was a public meeting place and it was a civic center. This is where people would argue over how the city should be. This was where public debates would take place. This is where issues would get worked out. Was in the agora, uh, this open area where people could talk and communicate and have speeches, etc. Um, the they would all Greek polises would form alliances with each other, usually against another polis. Um, Usually not for long. Usually wasn't a mass subjugation. It was usually okay. Hey, we kicked your ass. We took some stuff from you, and now go about your life. It wasn't now. It wasn't like where they would come in, take it over, and go, "Hey, now you belong to us." Yeah, we proved our point. Get on with your life. Um, the most powerful one, I'm sure you've heard of, was Sparta. Okay, I'm sure many of you have seen 300. Um, wasn't quite like that, but there was some things that were accurate. Um, Dorian was the original king of the city, um, and there was what was called the homoioi, which roughly translates to rule of equals. Okay, which is about 10% of the population. Most of the rest of the population was farm laborers who were basically slaves or called helots, who were ruled by the Hamoye. Um, there was a third class. Um, these were people who were there when the Spartans got there, and the Spartans were like, "Hey, we rule here now. You can kind of be here still. We'll let you." They're like, "Okay, thank you for not killing us." Um, there were 5 overseers who were elected annually by all the Hamoye, except for women, of course, by all the Hamoye over 30. Um, Boys were taken from their parents at age 7. And it's like, okay, you belong to the city now. Okay? And they were trained and raised, and they ate in the military mess until they were 60 years old. Like, you live, born, die a warrior. All right? Women were also put through strenuous physical training because it's like, okay, we need strong sons. And if you are not a strong woman, you will not give strong sons. If it looked like you weren't, if you were born and it looked like you had any physical defects, you were left to the elements to die. So they were not. There was not mercy. It was. This was a city that only the strong survived, and you were going to be strong or you would not make it. And so be it, right? You died in order to keep the city strong. Um, okay. The sanctuary uh, was put together. This is a place where men would come literally to drink together, share poetry, food, usually from the same military unit. And it was dedicated to the protecting deity for that city. Okay. Um, we have several important sanctuaries. Um, the Probably the most important one was the Oracle of Delphi. Um, Delphi is mentioned in many Greek legends. The Oracle was said to have divine inspiration from the gods, that this was a sacred place where she could receive inspiration. Now, and here's what actually happened with the Oracle. The cavern that she was in was actually had these vents from the ground, and these vents would put out hallucinogenic gases. So people would come in. She was high as hell on the gases, and she would give wisdom that, but it was usually cryptic. It was often not clear to where, regardless of what she said, she would be right. So, for example, they would come and say, who's going to win the battle? I see a clash of mighty kings, and today one king shall remove the other from the battlefield, and there shall be a new empire arise, right? Oh, we're going to win. I didn't say it was you, right? So things like that. Usually, often very careful to phrase things in a fashion to where it could be interpreted in a variety of ways. Um, okay, 121 talking about the various forms of columns. Um, no, look at those terms: the platform, the column, and the emblature. Okay, and then the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian pillars. Okay, good things to know. I'm not going to get into great detail on it, but please do take a note of that. Those terms will, good chance you're going to see those terms on the tests. Okay. Um, all right, Olympic Games. Um, so the Olympic Games were set up to allow a spirit of competition between the polises, to where they could bring their best against your best, and in nothing but true uh, peace, come together to put your arete against my arete, right? How do we compete the best against the best to become the best that we can be against each other? Um, the first contest of the first games was the 200-yard dash, the length of the stadion, where we get the word stadium from. Other early ones, chariot racing, boxing, pentathlon. God, wouldn't you love to see chariot racing come back? I mean, my God, would that not be just an amazing event in the Olympics? Um, and then the pentathlon, discus, javelin, long jump, sprinting, and wrestling. And they were brought back in 1896. Unfortunately, a lot of times the games are still politicized, which sucks. Um, and we're going to talk some more about this idea of it's on 123. Talk about anesthesai, which means to contend for the prize. Greeks were driven by this competition. Playwrights would try to write the best play. Philosophers would try to out-argue each other. So this idea was really important. Okay. Greek sculptors did the same thing. Now, this idea talks on 124. Koros to mean young man, this figure of a young man. And look at the one on 124, right, on the left compared to the one on the right. At some point, the focus of the competition among sculptors came to be on making the most lifelike, the most realistic body. Okay, and you can see the difference between the two, and as this idea developed, there's certainly Egyptian influences on Greek sculpture. For example, we see that pose, right? The left foot forward, fist by the side. So that you clearly see the Greek influences. 125, it talks about naturalism and like trying to represent things as close to the human form as possible. Now we do see the Koros focus for which was focused on Apollo, right, male god. But then we see the Korai, which is focused on female, okay, on the female form, and this was dedicated to Athena. And then we see the there on 125 an example there, okay. And then we see more and more development of this form. Okay, 127 talking about the geometric style, right? Putting these geometric patterns on the pottery surface, circles, rectangles, very geometric approach. And the Greeks really wanted to know the nature of the universe. This was important to their culture, coming to an understanding of what the universe was about. And they felt that they could come to an understanding of that through a combination of philosophy and mathematics. But mathematics was so important to them. And these geometric forms, their perfection in the geometry, they felt was a reflection of the higher planes. Okay? We talk about Pythagoras and the Pythagorean theorem, and that plays into that. Okay? 128, right? We see the example of a black vase figure, this mixture of clay and water, so that with the firing it remains black against a red background. And then on 129 we see the red figure vase, which is the reverse of that process, right? Where the characters are more in red with black backgrounds. So, all right. Let's talk about Sappho. So we have the word now sapphic, which refers to things that are lesbian in nature. And that comes because Sappho, who was was an early lesbian poet, praised the female form, fell in love with women, came from the island of Lesbos, one of those islands that we talked about, which again is where we get the term lesbian. Her poems were lyric, okay? So on themes of love, personal relationships. We don't have a lot of her work, unfortunately. Only fragments have survived. But what we have is truly amazing poetry, and it doesn't translate well to keep the meaning and the depth of meaning. They were meant to be sung to accompaniment of a lyre, okay? But really amazing poetry. The one we see there on 130, right, where she's in love with a married woman, and basically she describes her husband as this woman's husband as her hero because he has the love of the woman that she loves. So, okay. So moving towards Greek democracy, and this is the early ideas of our own democracy. So this starts with Solon, and Solon was a ruler of Athens, and he was a reformer, and he took over from a ruler called Draco, from which we get the term draconian. And Draco's laws were incredibly harsh. Anybody who owed money basically became a slave to the person that he owed money to. he couldn't sell or mortgage his land, but he had to mortgage what he made from that land in order to pay off his debts, and which basically made for a lifetime of servitude. Um, he canceled. So Solon came along. He canceled all debts, freed the peasants who had found themselves in debt to landowners and merchants. Put out a new code of law. He encouraged trade and commerce, right? As opposed to trying to focus on simply growing food, he tried to get people out there, right? Go trade, go bring things back here, take our products to the world. Um, he put a council of 400, which was comprised of landowners selected by Solon. And this group recommended policy. Um, Only the council could create policy, but the entire population of the city could vote on it. Okay? So, again, you see some of the early hints of what we have here in the U.S. Solon is regarded as the founding father of Athenian democracy, right? Um, Now, after Solon came Pisistratus, and he was a tyrant. Now, a tyrant and a dictator we think of now as a bad thing. It does take power away from the people. That doesn't necessarily mean that they were bad rulers. Um, he actually did some decent things. He advanced money to help the people in the surrounding areas with agricultural production. Um, he was overall a benevolent ruler. He recognized the wisdom of Solon's economic policies, kept on encouraging trade, put public works for building roads and drainage systems to keep the city, functioning. I mean, you got to have roads. Um, Pisistratus, when Pisistratus died, his son Hippias took over. Um, Whereas Pisistratus had been a tyrant, Hippias was even harsher. He would They used children as bargaining chips, people who opposed him, exiling nobles, executing others, and finally, with help from Sparta, Hippias was overthrown, and we have Cleisthenes, and he really instituted the first true Athenian democracy. Um, he divided the Athenian political system into what he called demis, which is, think of like wards in a city, right? Or boroughs, okay? Like in New York City, you have Brooklyn, you have the Bronx, you have Manhattan. This is what he did. Um, all citizens were registered in their given demi, and so landowners and merchants had equitable political rights. It wasn't just, you didn't have to be a landowner. As long as you were a citizen, you had rights. He then put those demis into 10 political tribes, and these tribes cut across family, class, regional lines, it didn't matter, which reduced the power of the nobility. Each tribe appointed 50 of their members to a council of 500, which only served for 36 days. Okay, so you essentially have 10 councils a year, and nobody could serve on a council more than twice in their life, which meant that you constantly had to be putting new blood in there. So there wasn't a chance for anybody to seize power, but by the groupthink, they hoped to turn in a better rule. All right, we're going to talk about the golden era of Greece next time. And the war against the Persians. So that should be a lot of fun. All right. Have a beautiful day. Get your discussion boards done. Make sure your quizzes are done. Talk to you later.